It is day 12th of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia has stepped up its offensive, launching aerial strikes. Several cities have faced massive aerial bombardment in the last few days. In central Ukraine, a barrage of Russian missiles razed a civilian airport to the ground. The Havryshovka airport in Vinnytsia has been completely destroyed. This after it was bombed by 8 Russian missiles. 9 people were also killed in the attack. Video released by Ukrainian emergency services showed firefighters trying to douse a blaze after the shelling. Visuals also showed the crumbling remains of a building at the airport. The latest attack took place in western area of central Ukraine. This is far away from the Russian and Belarus borders. This is a region that has seen far lesser strikes, indicating that the Russian operations are spreading across the country. The attack on the airport has renewed calls for a no-fly zone in Ukraine. A no-fly zone has become a commonly used term in this war. Ukraine wants the West to impose a no-fly zone. The West says any such plans are off the table. But what exactly is a no-fly zone, and why is the West on the fence about it? A no-fly zone is an airspace where enemy aircrafts cannot enter. If they do, they will be taken down. No-fly zones are often used to protect sensitive or even VIP areas. These include royal residences, sporting events, or large gatherings. Militarily, a no-fly zone is meant to stop the enemy aircraft. This could mean preemptive strikes or shooting the enemy aircraft down. Ukraine is currently facing massive Russian assault. Its cities are being bombarded by aerial strikes. So what Ukraine wants is a no-fly zone. This will help it counter the Russian aggression from the skies.
Конкретно вбивають наших людей.
I asked to close the sky. I turned to President Biden. I seem to have turned to Scholz, Macron. I say it seems because I make 20 to 30 international calls a day. I do it every day. And I said that if you can't block the sky now, then give us a time when.
Президента Байдена, я звертався до...
You see, NATO can only implement a no-fly zone if it sends planes to shoot down the Russian ones. This makes the risk of escalation too big. That would mean that NATO will be a direct part of the conflict. Imposing a no-fly zone isn't just about shooting down planes. NATO would have to be completely involved to enforce it. That means reinforcements to support the mission and to protect its own aircraft in the zone.
The only way to actually implement something like a no-fly zone is to send NATO planes into Ukrainian airspace and to shoot down Russian planes, and that could lead to a full-fledged war. In Europe, President Biden has been clear that we are not going to get into a war with Russia.
The Russian president warned against a no-fly zone. He says any attempt to impose it would mean participating in the conflict. This would be a major escalation for both Russia and the entire world.
We hear now that we need to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. It's impossible to do it over Ukraine itself. It is possible to do only from the neighboring states. But any movement in this direction will be considered participation in an armed conflict on the part of the country from which territorial threats to our military personnel are being made. At that exact moment, we will consider them as parties in military conflict, and it does not matter which members they are, members of whichever organization they are.
For the West, a no-fly zone over Ukraine is a no-no. But interestingly, they have imposed no-fly zones in the past. In 1991, the US and coalition partners established 2 no-fly zones in Iraq. In 1992, during the Balkans conflict, unauthorized military aircrafts were banned in Bosnian airspace. And in 2011, the UN Security Council approved a no-fly zone in Libya. Ironically, both the Bosnian and Libyan no-fly zones were both enforced by NATO. Well, to help us understand this better, joining us now are Ruslan Botnik, a political analyst and a director of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics. Ruslan is live in Ukraine's capital, Kiev. Irina Sukerman, the CEO of Scarab Rising Inc., and Mikey Kay, who is a former RAF pilot and an investigative journalist. Welcome all to WION. Ruslan, I will start with you. NATO has refused to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. They have continuously said that their job is to avoid escalations and not take part in this war. What do you make of NATO's role and its latest decision?
Of course, NATO is worrying about the big war in Europe. NATO is not ready today for competing with Russian Air Force. But we should understand that there are other ways for no-flight zone except of straight NATO interruption in Ukraine air. There are hybrid ways for a no-flight zone. For example, NATO should give us flights, should give us special weapon, anti-pilot weapon, and I think there are many volunteers in NATO countries who are ready to use this weapon in Ukraine without any government permission or NATO permission. So there are many ways, if we talk honestly, how to do it without straight interruption NATO inside Ukrainian-Russian conflict.
Irina, Putin has warned that NATO states should not offer their bases to Ukraine, and if countries impose no-fly zones, then they will be considered as taking part in this conflict. If they do get the jets, will Russia interpret it as NATO joining the war?
First of all, NATO has not landed any bases to Ukraine. I think this preposterous accusation was aimed to deter any possibility of getting Ukraine the assistance it needs. Second, as Ruslan mentioned, there's no need for NATO countries to directly get involved. Ukraine is capable of taking care of its own defense capabilities. We have seen that they've actually been fairly successful with even what they have against the Russian Air Force. So all they need is additional physical assistance, providing airplanes, and they don't need to be provided directly by NATO. They could just be transferred over to Ukraine through other countries. Many of them are too far away for Russia to even be engaged with in a conflict. But the third issue is that ultimately Russia's escalation continues, and it's not going to stop with Ukraine. Russia has threatened Sweden, Finland, Baltic states, and Poland. Some of these countries are NATO members. So while Ukraine is currently being used as buffer zones, if it is completely destroyed, Putin is not going to stop. He's going to eventually escalate on NATO's own turf.
Right.
In one way or another. He has already been attacking NATO states with cyber attacks. And at the end of the day, it's much better to take control of the situation before it gets to your own country. Russia cannot fight the whole world. Its own capabilities are quite limited, as we have already seen from this conflict. And when you want to have a solution, when you want to encircle a state's capabilities that are already weak, right. And seeing that Russia has already spread itself too thin, I don't think it's such a huge threat as NATO is trying to make it out to be.
Mikey, coming to you, how important are these jets for Ukraine? We haven't seen the Russian air supremacy so far in this war. Could NATO jets clinch the air battle?
Yeah, hi, Eric. Look, just a bit on my background here. I've flown combat missions for 20 years with the Royal Air Force. I've been involved in what's called CAOC operations, which is Combined Air Operations Center. It's where air battles are launched from. And I've also been in charge of battle space deconfliction. And I think we have to break this down because the no-fly zone debate it should be a nuanced debate. And when we're talking about air power, Eric, we're talking about two primary objectives. What's called OCA and DCA, offensive counter-air and defensive counter-air. Offensive counter-air is the attacking of air assets on the ground, such as air bases, to prevent them from flying. That's an offensive action. Defensive counter-air is shooting down enemy aircraft and preventing the enemy from flying in a particular airspace. And a no-fly zone is particular to DCA. It's not offensive, it's defensive. Now, there are a number of ways of cutting defensive counter-air. The first one is what everyone's talking about, which is establishing combat air patrols, or CAP, over Ukrainian airspace to deter Russian fighters. But there are other methods involved in DCA as well, which is surface-to-air missile systems. Now, they can be broken down into two. You can have radar-guided surface-to-air missile systems, and we've seen tractors towing Russian SA-13 Gophers away, which are these big tracked armored vehicles with a radar on and multiple missile sets on. But then you've also got the MANPADs, the man-portable air defense systems. They're shoulder-launched. Right. They're mostly IR-guided missiles, and the Stinger missiles that everyone's talking about fall into that category. Now, in terms of this escalation piece, or in terms of achieving a no-fly zone, you don't have to have combat air patrol jets in the air to deter and disrupt Russian air power. What you can do is you can flood the Ukrainian forces with US Stinger, and that will have a similar effect, and it will prevent the escalatory component that everyone's talking about. Let me just give you a scenario here, Eric. If you put NATO jets on a combat air patrol over eastern Ukraine, there is a scenario where potentially you could have an Ilyushin 76, which is a Russian transport aircraft that has been dropping Russian paratroopers close to the border and over the border in certain cities such as Kharkiv. You could have a situation where a NATO pilot has the option to shoot down one of these planes. Okay. An Ilyushin 76 with 50 paratroopers on board is a strategic asset. And if that happens, you will escalate what is going on now into something that the world really doesn't want to see. So what I would advise from my experience is through the proxy component of channeling US Stinger missiles and other MANPADs into the Ukrainian SF and into the Ukrainian forces to disrupt and deter Russian air power.
Mikey, thank you very much for breaking that down for us. Ruslan, I'll come back to you. Moscow and Kyiv are set to hold ministerial-level talks on March the 10th in Turkey. How do you assess Lavrov meeting Kuleba? Some positive outcome expected, perhaps?
I think any negotiation is a good mark. It is a possibility to find some resolution, or even in humanitarian sphere. But I don't have a big, I don't have any big good waiting for this meeting. I think it's more useful and more effective should be nowadays meeting in Belarus, where the delegation of Russia and Ukraine is meeting together to find in the resolution of the conflict. And other types of the diplomacy, we see like attempts of French President, Mr. Macron, like attempts of Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Bennett. They are not still working in such way which are believing it. They are making only humanitarian effect on the conflict, but not political. So that meeting of Ministry of External Affairs, it should be useful, but it's not such level in where this war should be resolved.
So you're not positive about the outcome of that meeting. Irina, coming back to you, satellite images show Russian forces advancing to the capital, Kiev. Critics argue that strategically the Russian convoy is a sitting duck. What do you make of that statement? And if Russia does succeed to seize Kiev, what impact will that have on this war? Briefly.
Basically, there are two possibilities. One is that the convoy is a decoy, in which case we should be looking at other parts of the country where Russia is more likely to try to strike and destroy first. We've already seen a little bit with Kherson. Some have thought that this decoy, this movement to Kiev was to protect the Russian troops that were trying to take over the southern part of the country. The other issue is that they are in fact advancing, but this convoy has been so large and so slow moving that it is in fact very easy to disrupt in a variety of ways before it ever gets there. Now, what happens if they do take it over? That depends on how you define takeover. Do they capture and destroy the entire government, in which case they will still have to hold power somehow, and they don't appear to have any natural political allies left. even pro-Russian parties have either switched sides or fled the country. If, on the other hand, we are talking about just taking over some buildings, then a very strong fight will continue until the city is liberated, and we've already seen that happen before. Russian forces entering major cities only to be repelled. Either way, Russia is not going to be able to hold on to Ukraine for long. Just strategically doesn't have enough forces.
Ruslan Botnik and Irina Sukaman, thank you for your input today. Mikey, stay with me. I want your insights on this next report. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.